But yeah, without further ado, welcome everybody. This is very exciting to be at first webinar of Open 2020. Open 2020 is a big event which will come together on the 11th and 12th of June. And in the run up to that, we're running this series of webinars in order to try and highlight some of the solutions and the existing networks, projects and protocols that contain some of the elements that we're looking for as commons building initiatives. So Open 2020 asks a big question. It's asking, could all the groups that are tinkering with platform co-ops and new economy projects out there come together to create an online event where we collectively figure out how can we enable small groups to form, exchange ideas, define shared purposes, and collaborate effectively, and even possibly trade within a global network of like-minded commons building initiatives. And it's really exciting to have Stacco here to talk to us about DisCOs, distributed cooperative organizations, because clearly DisCOs contain some of the elements that we're looking for, which enable small groups to form and exchange ideas and work and trade and collaborate together. So just before we dive into the presentation from Stacco, I just wanted to explain to anybody who doesn't know, because we had some comments that some of the language that we use here can sometimes be not terribly inclusive. So if there is anything that's unclear, please raise your hand and we will try and explain. But just to start off by defining co-op, a co-op is an organization which is collectively owned by its members. So it doesn't have kind of regular board of shareholders. It's an organization in which everybody gets a membership, and that membership entitles them to a vote. So collectively, they govern the entire organization. That's the basics of a co-op. And Stacco will go on to explain a little bit about what a distributed co-op is, and why that helps building towards the commons. So the commons is another term which we need to define, but I will pass you over to Stacco to do that.
Oh, the commons. So definitions of the commons are disingenuous by nature because they always point towards something that is not so easily explained and held. This is the frustrating thing about the commons. There's no elevator speech. You have to take the stairs and have a nice chat. So with the time constraints that we have, very quick explanation of the commons is that they're living systems to meet shared needs. And they're best understood as a verb, not a noun. So we say that there's no commons without commoning. So what do we need for commoning? We need three elements. So this is like a three-legged stool. If you take one leg off, you will fall over. And the three elements are, we need a resource. One, this resource needs to be governed by a community. Two, and it needs to be governed following the rules and protocols determined by the community. Three, not by the state, not by the market. So just to summarize that, the resources governed by a community according to the rules and norms of that community. And then to that we add with a focus on inclusion and fair sharing, because you could have a xenophobic commons. We could have we could have a resource of a community who are only one gender and one color, and we don't want anyone else to come in. And you see these types of dynamics all over feudalism. So we have to be a bit precise on what we mean when we talk about the commons. And despite its invisibility, the commons is all over. There's an estimated 2.5 billion people who derive their sustenance from natural resource commons in the so-called developing world. And we can argue that whether it's through proprietary or free software tools, there's also billions of people collaborating and creating shared resources online. So if we're talking about potentially more than half of the world's population, this is a terminology and a conversation worth having. In regards to the inclusivity of the language, there's a difference between putting a semantic barrier towards what you want to express and between that and actually being forthright in your language. Because when we talk about inclusion, we also have to realize that we've been listening to 40 years of bullshit neoliberal language talking about risk premiums and talking about things that most people do not understand, but they become part of the everyday conversation. So one of the ideals of DisCO and the commons work that we do is like, this is not so strange. And these are the words, these are the expressions that we need to handle and teach each other so we can create new economic systems if we don't have the language for it, because we really shouldn't be using the language of neoliberalism, which is proving itself so inadequate.
Excellent. Sounds good. Yeah, couldn't agree more about the old neoliberal language and how we need to, help. Basically, we need to help each other in creating a common language in order to build the commons. Right? We can't go around talking about risk and profit primarily as the most important things. But I recognize that the commons is not a terribly clear concept. But hopefully, during the process of this, we will grow to improve our understanding of that. Do you want to start with your presentation, Stacco, and we can dive straight into what is a distributed co-op?
Let's do it. So, in theory, you will confirm that you're able to see this beautiful graffiti illustration from Chiapas and maybe my face on the side.
Yep.
Okay, so let me just have a little try. So the name of the presentation, the DisCO Manifesto, which is co-authored by my partner Anne-Marie and myself, and the fruit of many conversations with lots of people, some of them present over here. If I Only Had a Heart is, of course, an allusion to the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, and this machine that wishes that had more humanity. And we use that as a metaphor to speak about several tendencies. Oops, that we see going on now. Which is technology, CAREWORK, and distributed cooperative organizations. It's also something that I'd like to talk about, which is posing this very cliche question, which is, what is the future of work? Up to a month and a half ago, when everything changed, there was a very cliche answer, which was, it's technology, it's automation. Meaning that as we gain efficiency in productivity, more and more goods and services will be produced without the input of humans, and this will bring about the age of leisure and great creativity. And this is nothing new. This is what Marx was saying in the 1850s. This is what Keynes was saying in the 1930s while proposing a 15-hour work week. None of that happened. So the more things change, the more they remain the same. And why is that? This is because technology follows the ideology and the wishes of those who fund the technology, those who put the money. And we see this again and again. So technologies which are very promising. Hello, Internet, it's 1995, and we're crying out loud in joy at the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. Technologies increasingly get co-opted, not only by capitalism, but by feudalism or others. And technologies or ways of life which are decentralized or peer-to-peer. And you can think about commoning, in even pre-agricultural times, do get co-opted by hierarchy and power. So one of the technologies that speaks towards a notion of decentralizing hierarchy is the blockchain. I'm sure you've all heard of the blockchain. Many of you will understand the blockchain, and some of you may be able to explain it in simple terms to people. And within the blockchain, we see a phenomenon called the DAO. And I'm not talking about Lao Tzu, but decentralized autonomous organizations. I'm going to offend anyone who's proficient in DAOs by giving a very bastardized explanation of this complex phenomena. But you can think of them as robot organizations that can run on smart contracts. So what this means is that imagine an organization that runs itself and can enter into legally binding contracts and agreements with people or other organizations, levy penalties if those contracts are not being fulfilled, and execute and make payments. So we're basically talking about kind of like self-running machine intelligence that wields its own economic power, that it can fire people, hire people, and make economic decisions. Of course, this is programmed by humans, but there's a tendency within the DAO space to do away with human messiness. And just because of brevity, Imagine what happens when we combine artificial intelligence and machine learning with distributed systems that cannot be easily taken down because they live not in just one server, but all over the place. So this is like the many heads of the Hydra. You know, you chop off one head and another one arises. And if we go down the kind of like dystopian porn side of things, you could imagine, you know, like Skynet scenarios. I'm just using these exaggerations because there is a tendency for technology to be co-opted for ends which are not very nice. So another thing that happens in the DAO space, and we have many contacts there and many friends and really worthwhile projects, but there's a lot of talk, again, of decentralization. This is a cherished word, but if you don't decentralize the trifecta of hierarchy, which is capitalism, the patriarchy, and colonialism, your promises of decentralization do not hold much sway, at least to us. So the group that we work with, we figured, okay, we need cooperative, feminist, and commons-oriented alternative to DAOs, to decentralized autonomous organizations. So enter distributed cooperative organizations. By calling them DisCOs was too boring, so we came up with, ta-da, hey, DisCO. Or to be more precise, Disco.coop, which is, we're very happy that we got the domain, the distributed cooperative organization. And what this is in a nutshell, it's a framework, it's a set of tools and practices for people that want to work together in cooperative, commons-oriented, and feminist economic ways. And we'll go into this now. So the DisCO DNA combines these 4 elements. If you look at them while I talk, you'll see that they don't necessarily talk to each other, even though we see a very exciting overlap. So the commons we've spoken about, shared resources to meet living needs, where, you know, there's the resource, the community that gathers around it, and the protocols to govern it. And peer-to-peer, peer-to-peer is a system usually spoken about in software tech topologies of how nodes connect to each other. But behind the nodes, behind the computers, there are human beings that need to be fed and cared for. So this is like the more social understanding of peer-to-peer. Open co-ops is a continuation of platform co-ops, where we ask, platform co-ops are great, but it's not enough to have a more democratic Airbnb or a more friendly Uber if we're not talking about housing, if we're not talking about transportation. Why are we doing this work? What is the end product? So this is the open co-op work, which we developed in Peer-to-Peer Foundation for a number of years. Open value accounting is something that predates the blockchain, but also prefigures many of the value redistribution practices in there. And this is where my colleagues, Bob Hogan and Lynn Foster, have been very involved. And this comes from the free software movement, the problem of how do we reward contributions to a shared project, to a commons. Meaning, what happens when somebody gets paid by IBM, but there's some maintainer who's doing all this work voluntarily? How do we reward that? And finally, feminist economics examines the gendered aspect of economics and how CAREWORK and effective labor, having children, taking care of them, feeding people, plays into mainstream economics, while mainstream economics externalizes all these factors. So those are the 4 main components which we want to cross-pollinate within the DisCO framework. And DisCO didn't arise from a white paper. If you're not familiar, white papers are routinely peddled in the blockchain world, sometimes to promote ICOs, which are kind of like a reverse crowdfund. And white papers are beautiful architectures for more decentralized outcomes, but there's a tendency for people to give up blueprints and then to kind of like fit in the humans. So with us, our ideology, the DisCO framework, arose from this community of practice, from these humans called the Guerrilla Media Collective. And here we are, happy in the olden days of not having to be socially isolated and, you know, like hugging and those types of things. And this is an alternative vision of us where we drew portraits of ourselves. And there's Timothy in the corner as a llama. And so the Guerrilla Media Collective is best known for the commons-oriented translation collective, Guerrilla Translation. So Guerrilla Translation is a project that I co-founded with my partner Anne-Marie in 2013, when the echoes of Occupy and 15M were still being heard loud. And Anne-Marie's from New York. I'm from Spain. If you're not familiar, 15M, it was the Spanish version that predated Occupy by a few months. So we had friends in Zuccotti, we had friends in Spain, so we wanted to start translating resources, and we created Guerrilla Translation. And it operates as an activist collective, making a commons, making these translations that would otherwise not exist available. But it's also an agency, and it's an agency because we wanted to self-fund our activist work. So the DisCO framework is based on the governance model that was originally developed for Guerrilla Translation.
So let's just, sorry, Stacco,
yeah.
we just pause there because that is pretty novel, what you've just highlighted there. So Guerrilla Translation is an example of a distributed co-op, and its purpose is to do two things, or maybe one thing with the other thing to support the first thing. So you act like a business and you have paying clients. So you're an agency that does translation for anybody who'd like to book you. And then you use income from that paid work to support your activist translation, which maybe you can explain a bit more about. What is that? Is that a good summary?
That's a good summary, but let's talk about why.
Right.
And I think it's a particularly relevant question now, where people who are volunteering are being celebrated, where people who are in the front line, whether it's in the medical or distribution field, are being hailed as heroes while they're under incredible stress with very low-paying jobs and martyrs. So there's this idealism of like, oh, I'm a philanthropist, I'm an activist, but I think that activism is also based on privilege. Because if you're the mother of various children and you're holding down 2 jobs and have to commute from one to the other, at 11 at night, you're not going to have like much time for your activism. So we figured that activism has to be incorporated into the workflow somehow. And this is how we do it with, I'll give you an example from Guerrilla Translation, that maybe we can do some brainstorming together, like how can we apply this model in other places?
Perfect.
So we're translators, yeah? Let's say that Dill has an article which we think is really cool. So we're going to choose to translate that pro bono. So we're going to say, hey, Dill, we're going to translate your article because we really like it. And we want to create a commons out of it. We want to share it with the people that can read it in another language. So Dill says, okay, let's do it. So imagine that Dill's article is 1,000 words long. What we do is that we assign this as internal credits to the team that produces the translator. So, credits are created and we call this love credits, okay? So, that translation is published. We share it in our blog, which you can find here, guerrillatranslation.org for English. But then next week, Lynn comes along and says, hey, Stacco, I'm part of this project and we need this thing translated by Tuesday. And then we say, you choose. It's not us approaching you to offer a translation, but you want us to do a gig. So we put the other hat on. Now you're talking to the agency. So we will send Lynn a budget. Happy coincidence, what she wants us to translate is also 1,000 words. So we will give her a quote of 100 euros, okay? So we do the work for Lynn, this gets sent, and we send an invoice, and when Lynn or her organization pays us, we get 100 euros. Now, out of those 100 euros, 25 will go to fulfill those pro bono credits that we created before, while the other 75 will go to fulfill the livelihood credits, the agency work. It's a lot more complex than this. We can share, there's quite a thorough governance model on how this works. Another way to look at it is that anyone in the collective is accruing different types of share. And one type of share is for the agency work that you do. Another type of share is for the pro bono work, for the creation of commons. But a third type is CAREWORK. It's the affective and reproductive labor that takes place in the collective, and which we think is endemic to any collective. And perhaps more so when you're working digitally. And this is another question of the times, so to speak. We see a lot of talk now about how do we work as distributed teams, how we're forced to work over the internet. But what about the affective work? What about the human interactions that maybe you have in a workplace? So this model value tracks 3 things: commons-oriented pro bono work, ethical, market, livelihood work, and care and reproductive work for a fair distribution of income. And this is all based on the 7 DisCO principles. So, you know, we have 8 patterns for Ostrom. We have the 7 original cooperative principles. So the DisCO principles are not riding in a white horse to take over anything, but to be complementary to these practices. And those of you familiar with co-ops, we all love co-ops, but they have several problems. They don't scale, and I'll talk and criticize about scaling in a minute. But often the, you know, co-ops are good for their own membership, but beyond the layer of those who are worker owners in the co-op, there's a whole economy, there's a whole series of people who are involved in the economic, who are, sorry, not involved, but who are influenced by the economic decisions of a co-op. And then, for example, we hailed Mondragon as this great hero of cooperativism, but because of economies of scale, the Mondragons of this world are forced to adapt capitalist practices. And you end up with things like demutualizations of co-ops, etc. So while we promote co-ops, we think, okay, these 7 principles need to be, you know, held to task. How do we do this? And how do we do something that takes advantage of the opportunities that we see in technology now? Thus, the 7 DisCO principles. So I'll just run them down quickly, and maybe we can talk about later how they're actually relevant for what's going on right now. So number 1, oops, sorry, is that they're oriented in the statutes in the legal form towards the common good. The common good is kind of like a bullshit term because everyone says that they're working for the common good to advance their own agenda. So we can swap that for social and environmental ends. Do something that, as our friends in Spiral say, you know, like do stuff that matter. So in this case, production is not guided by profit, but by social and environmental priorities. And the DisCOs, the organizations, embed this value in their cultural, productive, legal, and technical structures and statutes. The second principle is that the, they're multi-constituent. So in a DisCO, decision-making goes beyond the structure of the co-op to include the value chain of everyone that's affected by the co-op's actions. So beyond workers, this can include, you know, neighboring communities, suppliers, clients, and also reproductive and effective labor. Good examples of this are the social care co-ops in Emilia-Romagna and Quebec. So just to simplify, instead of privatizing the hospitals or social care, how about we give the franchise to a co-op? And over here you have 4 types of decision. You have 4 votes. One of them would be by the municipality or the state, they are providing the funds. Another one by the doctors, nurses, and social care workers. Another one by the patients, and another vote by the family members of the patients. So straight away, you can see how this is like a much more realistic mapping of economic interactions and decision making. So principle number 3 is that they actively co-create commons. The behavior of market enterprises is that they take from the commons, they enclose and they turn nature into commodities and relationships into services. So DisCOs stewards existing common wealth to generate new forms of shared resources. And in the example that I've given you of Guerrilla Translation is we do this by doing our pro bono work, so we're creating new commons. And these commons can be digital, they can be knowledge commons, or they can be material. Principle number 4 is that they're transnational in nature. They're locally embedded and globally oriented. Also incredibly relevant right now. Obviously, like our supply chain, our globalized supply chains are proving to be woefully inadequate to deal with what's going on right now. So we need to relocalize production. But while we relocalize production, we have to keep information flowing globally. The ideas that we have in one place can be implemented and developed and changed in another place. So this follows this design global, manufacture local logic, where you have like global design commons or blueprints, but actual manufacturing is made in place. And this is not just, I don't want you to just think of like maker spaces and 3D printing, but also of artisanal labor, food production, etc. We need the systems where information flows globally and the stuff that you can grasp with your hand happens close to you. The following principle, is that they're centered in CAREWORK. And this is the feminist economic aspect. And over here, we distinguish between two types of care work. One is for the health of the collective. We see a DisCO as a living entity that's kind of like a trust. And it's a trust upholding the values of the people that decide to enter into this economic agreements with each other. These are our values. We want to care for these values. So in Guerrilla Media Collective, what is the health of the collective? Well, we need to be doing pro bono translations. We need to take care of each other, and we need agency work. If the collective is not healthy in any of those areas, we have to take action. But the other type of care work is that we take care of each other. There's very strong mutual support mechanisms where we're always aware of the affective and emotional dimensions of those who are showing up. The next principle is that DisCOs reimagine the origins and flows of value. The value system that we have right now does not reflect realities, and if all the research is right, it's not making people happy, propagating alienation and disenfranchisement. So in DisCOs, we propose that we value things that I've described before, which is the creation of commons, which is effective labor, which is care work, not only that work that gets rewarded by the market. And the last principle is that they're primed for federation. And what this means is that collectives are very good because they, networks share certain ideologies, but they don't necessarily have shared goals. So federations are actually held together by common commitments. And federating follows both the topology of the internet and the proposed topology of the blockchain and decentralized autonomous organization. But just having a decentralized structure, decentralization of technological structures is not decentralization of outcomes. And here's where the cooperative movement can teach us many things. And also, it's very interesting how we think about federating instead of scaling. There's also this tendency within the blockchain world. It's like, how do we scale? We have to scale. If you think about it, scaling is taking something small and just making it bigger and raising everything in its path. And this is the mentality of colonialism. So in DisCOs, what we propose is a federation protocol where each DisCO or each node in a DisCO has 15 to 20 people, because this is how you can get to know each other. This is how you can practice care work. One of the hot potatoes in the blockchain space is trustlessness. But how about we create small groups where we trust each other, where we don't have to cryptographically validate and tokenize every human interaction that we have. So this is what we propose with DisCOs. And just to close that off, I'll give you the famous quote from David Fleming, which I think I've successfully inserted in every single talk that I've given from the last 2 years, which is, large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require an abundance of small solutions within a large-scale framework. So we think that the small solutions are individual DisCOs, and the large-scale frameworks are P2P systems or a larger DisCO framework. So if you fancy these ideas and want to have a ripping good read, I will direct you to our manifesto. We call that manifesto in a self-deprecating way. And this is our anti-white paper, and it's full of fun language and really good titles and art. And for more resources, you can go to Disco.coop. Here's some contact emails and stuff, and we can share all these links after the fact. Sign up to our newsletter, blah, blah, blah. And that's it for the presentation side. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Stacco.
Let's open it up.
Immediately, that makes me have a couple of questions, and then I want to open it up and we'll hear some other people. But my first question is really about member classes. So in a standard platform co-op, normally you would have probably 3 or 4 different member classes. Like, it's quite common if we say, look at Stocksy as an example, they have the workers who actually run the platform. They sort of control the day-to-day aspects, the organization of the business, if you want to call it that. Then they have investors who literally just provide cash and don't necessarily get the same amount of say as they would in a normal PLC or limited company. And then they have the suppliers, the photographers who are taking pictures and uploading them to their website. And they have the customers who are buying the rights to use those photographs or videos. So kind of 4 fairly standard member classes. And that's fairly typical across all platform co-ops. Do DisCOs have member classes in the same way?
DisCOs have to answer. And this is something that I will keep going back to. I can tell you about the experience in Guerrilla Media, but constituent classes have to do with the idiosyncrasies of like a particular organization. This is also something that's relevant to the comment because, again, like neoliberalism like puts us into like neat categories. You're a producer, you're a consumer, you're a politician, you're a voter. And the commons kind of like mixes it up all together because you can be someone 1 minute and you may want to express yourself in another way. Things that are interesting to look at, the UK in particular have like really good multi-stakeholder laws. And we looked for Guerrilla Media about forming a UK co-op, but hello Brexit, didn't happen. So we're currently a Spanish socially oriented non-profit co-op. So we're already a non-profit, but also in our statutes, our work has to be towards social and environmental ends. Fair shares is a really interesting model of multi-constituent structures. The Purpose Foundation does something similar. There's a lot of ways to cut this. The way that we do it for translation is that we have this dating metaphor, yeah? So we have casual members. Someone hands in a translation, we copy edit it, we put it in the blog. We actually track the value of that translation, but that person does not get paid because, hey, it's a casual relationship. If someone wants to work with us, we go through a dating phase. And, you know, we're checking each other out. Do we like each other? And this lasts for 9 months. Once the 9 months are over and we have this whole mutual mentoring process, we become committed. We have a committed relationship and we move in together. So these are the, I don't want to talk about member classes, but these are kind of like the permeable membranes where you can, how you can work in Guerrilla Translation. If you become a member, what does this mean? It means that the whatever pro bono work you did as a casual member now begins to get paid. You have accrued that as shares. But of course, before we start mutualizing economic value, we want to make sure that we work together fine, that we trust each other within these small nodes. This can also be amplified to like networks and transacting with like other organizations, whether they're DAOs, they're DisCOs, they're co-ops, they would be like another class. We also have to distinguish because we've done most of our thinking around work around co-ops rather than consumer co-ops. But of course, hybrids are very, very interesting thing to look at. And hopefully we'll be looking at that with the research.
So, okay, so it could be either way, like in your example with translation, if you're in a casual relationship, you're not technically legally part of the co-op, but you are in a casual relationship. And then as you come through that permeable membrane, you become a kind of legal owner of the co-op. But I guess what you're saying is that could be structured in different ways depending on the purpose of your DisCO and also depending on the country in which you incorporate.
Yeah, please do, because I mean, the second half of your sentence is incredibly important, and we cannot proclaim this great DisCO vision without looking at like individual legislation. We have the figure of the EU co-op, and then there's something else which would be interesting to research, that as we see like DAOs being created and they exist on chain, if we could get the attention of ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the International Cooperative Organization to recognize on-chain structures as actually co-ops. This is something for the future to contemplate. But in our case, yes, we're worker owners, but the exciting thing is for DisCOs to determine how they work with the legislation and also what their deal is, because we want there to be as much variety as possible. If you want to become a DisCO, this is what we say. Figure it out. These are the 7 principles, and these are the workshops that we do. So you're a veterinary clinic. You're a group of sex workers. You're a cinema. How do you become a DisCO? How do you fulfill these 7 principles? And then the greatest ideas come out of that. But these DisCOs have to create their own governance model. And the governance model leads into the software architecture, which Lynn and Bob can talk about. But I don't know, this is like also like a very Marxist thing. It's like, what will happen when the working class takes power? Well, the working class has to figure it out. You know, like, don't ask me, people have to figure it out together. So for us, the purpose now is to create more DisCOs, to have more pilots, and to have more resources for people to create DisCOs, and then have that conversation. And if you go to like the Guerrilla Media has like a massive wiki, and this is our experience, this is our governance model. I'm sure you can take inspiration for this, but please just make it your own.
So I want to stop asking questions, but I've got one more, and then yeah, we'll hear from Lynn. So I really liked your federating, not scaling comment. Like, I think that's bang on, and it really sort of highlights the difference between this model and, like you said, the old capitalist hierarchy, grow as much as you can model. But obviously that's easier said than done. So for example, with the platform Co-op, again, let's look at Stocksy as our example. If they'd grown their organization to only have 20 photographers, then they would have produced a pretty crap photography library, because there wouldn't be many pictures there, so not many people would go to it, and it just wouldn't be so practical as a service. So for them, clearly scale is key. And I'm kind of wondering how you deal with that dichotomy as well, because federating and having multiple organizations doing the same thing sounds great if you're doing something like growing local vegetables. But if you are doing something that exists more in a digital realm, which transcends borders and boundaries and grows and can benefit from the network effects of having more members, then how do you deal with that? For example, so talking about translation as well, obviously translation could be federated out fairly easily, but there might be scenarios in which it's more useful to have a larger organization, which, you know, you can kind of have a big funnel where anybody can throw their request for translation in, and then it gets farmed out to a federated structure or something. How do you sort of balance those two different requirements?
It's very easy because it's not a false dichotomy. And I think that one of the great conversations that we need to have right now is about modularity and kind of like holonic networks. So for example, in Guerrilla Translation, legally it's Guerrilla Media Collective. So we have other two nodes. One of them is Guerrilla Graphic Collective that does UX and graphic design. And the other one is Guerrilla Agitprop that does marketing, but of course we don't want to say marketing, so it's called Agitprop. Those are within the main node because now it's 14 or 15 people. But eventually, even though we're under the same co-op, the graphic collective would go its own way. But I mean, it would go in its own way in the sense of daily relationships of trust, of who you're talking to, who you're working with more closely. The legal structure is the same. We can be a federation of co-ops and we can still mutualize economic value. For Stocksy, let's imagine that you have a group of photographers that is working, that's doing stock photography in one area, or maybe they're in one physical location. And maybe it makes sense for them to get some tax breaks for wherever they are. So they set up a legal structure, but this legal structure still mutualizes value. This is why DLTs and open value accounting is very important for this kind of thing. So again, I think I saw a comment from Grace about scaling. And I think that we should stop thinking about quantity as scaling, where we can have replication. And we can have replication and communication, which again, mirrors the structure of the internet and mirrors the ideas of decentralization. So the idea of this, of the DisCOs, is to actually have an economic counterpower. I'll trot out some of my favorite figures that have to do with co-ops. So we have 2.5 million cooperative societies worldwide with 1 billion members and an annual turnover of 3 trillion. $3 trillion US is the market cap of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple. So it's like co-ops already have the economic power to take on the big behemoths, but that sixth cooperative principle, which is cooperation among co-ops, is not being enacted. We don't have the technological tools, but more importantly, the social and cultural practices for this to do this. DisCO is our answer. There have to be many more answers, but this is what we offer to tackle this particular question.
Okay, cool. There's a bunch of comments and questions coming through the chat, but let's switch over to Lynn if we can. Lynn, if you'd like to unmute yourself, because I think it's important, like that point there led into the kind of open value accounting. And I think it'd probably be useful to go back and look at the example where you mentioned that you were paid 100 euros, 25% of that turned into love credits, 75% paid, I believe, for the work that was done. And then we had the CAREWORK as well, which was thrown into the mix. So Lynn, can you explain a little bit more for us about the kind of open value accounting method?
I can give it a shot here. Open value accounting has been in development for some years. Sensorica is kind of the flagship example, and they put a lot of thought into this. Like value accounting without the open was around before that, but they definitely put the open into it. They structured themselves completely openly. Their software is open to anybody to see and all members to be involved in kind of anywhere. The DisCO, the Guerrilla translators are, have been doing something very similar, and both of them you would call something like contributive accounting, where people get paid if there's income of any sort. People get rewarded based on their contributions, and you should be able to track that back as far as you want to, right? And there might be kinds of contributions that might be rewarded differently. And as Stacco can explain some of the specifics there for Guerrilla translators, for example, but that should be for the group itself to decide. And so there seems to be a lot of interest right now in contributive accounting. It's sort of, and it's certainly not the only way to do things, right? And, there are barter kinds of things, there are gift economies, there's, to each, according to, et cetera, to each from each. So there, or just think about a UBI, Universal Basic Income. So there are a lot of ways to think about it, and there are a lot of experiments, and this is one of them.
Can you
answer it, Ollie?
Sort of, yeah, I like it. I mean, I'm wondering if maybe you can give us an example. If we go back and look at Stacco's example of the €100 comes in, is it always in the Guerrilla Translation example, just because it's useful to go through a sort of case study? Like, is the split between the love credits and the sort of paid work always the 25-75 split?
It is currently, but we're experimenting with it. So, for example, when there's also like certain types of capital that can go into the love work with the pro bono. So imagine that we get like a bunch of donations from people. We could actually tweak that percentage on any given month. We chose 75-25 because obviously we need to put our availability towards getting paid, so we can, pay back this magic money that we've created. In our internal agreements, this tallies up to about like 2 full days of work every 3 months, which is like 400 love credits. This is the way that we've done it. But for example, say that you have a cafe, yeah? And you have leftover food, so you do dinners, or you give food to people who may, have difficulties in sourcing their sustenance, and this could be your pro bono work. So and this is also your labor, it's just not your material that you're going towards this. But again, like Lynn says, is for every individual situation, it has to be figured out and then hopefully documented, so we can have a very accessible database. Documented is not enough. You can have this great wiki, but if you don't have a curated narrative, the documentation just baffles people. But we can have storytelling, we can have like many examples. And eventually, if we have like a good knowledge base, it's like, oh, you're also doing translation, or you're working digitally, or you're working with the earth. Here are the precedents. Maybe this is something that someone did in your local legislation.
Got it. Got it. There's some disagreement here going on in the chat, so I just wanted to clear this up now. Like, a DisCO isn't an on-chain entity, right? Like, we don't need a blockchain to be a DisCO.
No, but it helps because again, like there's a spectrum from trustless to trustworthy. So when you need to enter into trustless interactions, having cryptographically validated transactions is very useful. Do this have to happen on a public blockchain? Or can we be looking at IPFS or secure scuttlebutt or other systems before defaulting to blockchains and just proclaiming that, you know, sidechains and sharding are going to take care of all the scaling, efficiency, and energy issues? We also have to look at other options. But I think that distributed ledgers in general are very important if we want to have this great federated economic interactions. But, you know, you can do the accounting with statistics. You can do them with spreadsheets. We've been doing them with spreadsheets for years, and it's a pain in the ass. So this is why we're working with Bob and Lane to get the MVP off the ground.
Bob, but, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you want to explain maybe your thoughts about, using the chain or not using the chain? Do you want to unmute yourself? We can't see you either, Bob.
Was I supposed to take that one?
Go for it if you can, or just talk to us about like your thoughts about the complexities of moving this stuff on chain. Like Stacco says, it works with spreadsheets, but it's hard work, and if we want to get to this fully federated
okay, yeah, I can talk about that. We just had a conversation about that with a bunch of different people. So one of the things, once you put it on a blockchain, if you're talking about a Bitcoin style blockchain or Ethereum style blockchain, number one, it's very slow. Number two, therefore, it cannot scale to mass quantities of people and transactions. Number three, the Bitcoin blockchain takes more electricity than the Czech Republic, the whole Czech Republic, some 10 million people. So this is a very inefficient structure, but if you want to do a global digital currency, you need global consensus, and the Bitcoin model, that blockchain model was the first practical global consensus mechanism ever. So it's like it's a brilliant achievement, but it's very costly in many different ways. So in real life, if you're talking about groups which trust each other internally, and they interact with groups where the groups have some trust with each other, then really all you need is, and you don't need a global digital currency, then all you need is consensus around among the participants in a given agreement or transaction. And you do need that, and you do need that to be reliable. So we're looking at alternative technologies. One of them, which is Holochain, and the other one is ActivityPub, which ActivityPub, and also known as the Fediverse, on a Mastodon example. So those are existing tech, and then Secure Scuttlebutt, but there really hasn't been a lot of. There was a project that was going to start in Brazil using Secure Scuttlebutt for a community economic system, and we still think that's really brilliant. But what they first have to do is implement a mesh network so that community economy will come later. So there are these projects going on, and there is a project going on in Europe that's called Reflow, that is going to use ActivityPub and the value flows vocabulary, and it's being done by the people who are behind Commons Pub, and that will use some technology coming from Dyn, which is to think and do organization, where they have something called Zen Room, which implements secure agreements within the framework of something like a small group or different organizations. So that will be so that's sort of the first attempt in Holochain is promising those kinds of things too, but it's not really up and running yet. And the Reflow ActivityPub, those will be two projects going on to try to do federated agreements, not using blockchains, but using much more local agreements. I think also I have to say that another way to think about all this stuff, and we have the representatives here, is mutual credit.
Yeah, no, great. That felt like a weird place to stop. Like, how would you see implementing mutual credit as part of open value accounting?
Well, there's two projects going on now that want to do that. And there's one of them is in Holochain and the other one's an ActivityPub. And we'll see which one gets there first. But there is existing software out there that Matthew Slater and others have created for doing mutual credit. And it's being used, and it's being used by some of the same people that want to do it in a more federated way. So it's, you know, it's a mature, it is a mature set of logic, you know, it's stuff that people have done and do know, and we love it.
Absolutely, yeah. It would be remiss of me not to give the Open Credit Network a plug, because that's another open co-op project. So I wanted to open it up now for questions. We've still got 30 odd people here attending and 5 panelists, so it'd be nice to hear from some other voices. If anybody wants to ask a question, just raise your hand, and then we can unmute you. You can stick yourself, just hit your camera on, and yeah, unmute yourself and ask questions of Stacco or Bob or Lynn or myself. Simon is saying, Mark, good question, but not quite sure what that question is. Anybody here want to speak?
So I've got Mark's question, which is a really good question. So Mark, I would encourage you, rather than me reading out loud, if you want to get on and maybe expand on it, and we can talk about it.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're very loud.
Yeah. All right, okay, I'll speak more quietly. I don't see a way to unmute my video, if that's the correct term. Yeah, my question was, when we're talking about DisCOs, and particularly the sort of scaling through federating, are we looking at creating transnational COTs which have no legal personality anywhere? There's no incorporated legal form for them. And any tax liability would basically be the trade of the individual member. So,
yeah, so Mark?
I think he just got cut off there.
He snipped off his sentence because he's got like this big pair of like flower cutters.
Am I back?
You're back,
Yes, you
sorry
are.
about that.
Yeah, so did you hear my my first bit of my question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my second bit was, rather than creating these transnational sort of ethereal co-ops, are we creating something that's legally incorporated in a particular jurisdiction? I think in the case of the Guerrilla Translation co-op, you are, yeah. Or is it more than that?
Again, like, I will keep coming back to this answer, which is like, I don't know, this has to be figured out. What I can posit is that we have to try everything. We have to do both things. I think that this has to be bottom up, and I would advocate for people looking at the co-op law. We have to investigate more about the EU co-op figure, but we can also have hybrid structures where you can have like a foundation, like the Linux Foundation, like the Wikimedia Foundation, that kind of like holds the larger economic structure, and then you can have like individual co-ops. But this is where we also have to figure out the legal mechanisms for mutualization of capital, including crypto. There's also like another aspect to it. I think that disobedience is a really great thing, and that many social advancements have happened as a matter of disobedience. So this is where like our friends from Fair Co-op, etc., and that whole side have been doing things. And I think that it's very interesting to create hybrid things. You know, like we are doing double accounting in a way. I mean, we do now internal accounting, and we can see what shares and what value flows we have while we figure out how to legally enact those. And this can be a combination of fiat, this can be a combination of fiat and mutual credit and crypto. Again, this is an ongoing process that we have to figure out. I would advocate that for that process to take place, don't have some great genius with it's usually his white paper telling you how to do things. It has to be figured out together, and it's going to be messy. There's a desperation to like, we have to break the silos, we have to do the great thing. But I don't know, dude, like if you come from permaculture, you know that resilience is one of the most important things that you can do. And having things which are structurally similar is very important because one of them may fall down. And again, this follows also the topology that we like to speak of when talking about distribution or IPv6 or TCP/IP, etc.
Mark, does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the sort of humility around the, you know, we don't have to have the answers. We're a community of practice exploring into this space, and yeah, we'll find what we find here.
Cool. Yeah, me too. I think, yeah, clearly this is more of a pattern, right? As in the term pattern language, than it is a definitive set of answers. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Grace, you had a question. It'd be nice to hear from you.
Yeah, I was interested in the DisCO, how you deal with things like quality assurance and client services. Because you mentioned dating, and that kind of is like, well, if you're just not good enough, you don't get in here. But it doesn't address like training and making mistakes and rehabilitation. So that was my question.
So the way that we do it when offering goods and services, it's kind of funny because Guerrilla Translation, while we parrot the language of distribution and we're into all this cutting edge technology, we don't do machine translation. It's all handmade. And there's always like one translator and one editor. So it's like this very slow process. And there's a lot of CAREWORK in it. So how do we assure the proficiency in the goods and services that we're offering in the market? We do a test. So this is the thing. There's a lot of confusion sometimes between a commons and commons-based peer production. I'll try to be very brief. Commons-based peer production are permissionless contributory systems like Linux, Wikipedia, etc. You show up, you give your contribution, and then it's validated after the fact. We cannot do that on a walk-around co-op because we have to offer these goods and services to the client for the survival of the co-op. So for the Graphic Collective, we approached people that we knew, that we already had worked with them, so we had working relationships. For translations, we do translation tests, and this tells us that this person can translate. With that being said, there's always like a mutual learning process in the art of translation. But then a lot of it is just down to like internalizing the logic of the economic system. So you're not just following the signals, but you know why you agree with these values, and getting to know each other.
Makes sense. Michael, you had a question.
And Bob had his hand up, so maybe after Mike.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So I appreciate the webinar so far. It's been really interesting. I'm kind of new to the space of, I don't know what you'd say, co-ops, organizing people. I'm more like software engineer, actually have like a kind of researchy computer science background. And I was last working on Cardano, the blockchain system. So I guess my question is, yeah, how would you, for someone who's like a more programmer hacker type, what would you say is the best way to get involved in this kind of thing? It seems like a lot of the work is maybe more organizational, but there's still kind of tooling needed.
Maybe Bob and Lynn can, what's the programmer hacker types?
Well, there are various collectives of people working on various pieces of this puzzle. There's a group forming around the DisCOs, DisCO Coding Collective or something like that. And I think should be hopefully always ways to plug in for people who would like to help out. There's not often money, right? So this is a lot of love work. Occasionally, there are grants involved, but not usually. So that's the caveat for you. But you can throw out some ways for you to get a hold of people, Michael, because that'd be awesome.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
And Bob, did you want to comment? Stacco said you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I was going to comment on a previous moment, unfortunately, but maybe it'll still become. So people were asking, how do you do, like, say, like a global open organization and also be legal in various jurisdictions? So Sensorica worked this out in a way that I think is decent. So Sensorica, the network has no legal organization. It has no legal identity. So when they need a legal identity, they set up what they call an exchange firm, and they throw it out there, and basically all it does is a front for the network. So when they need a bank account, they have their legal organization that does nothing much more but hold bank account. You know, so it's like, you set up a front, okay, and it's working for them. And you know, so if they needed a front in, they have members in Pakistan. So if they need a front in Pakistan, then they'd set up a exchange firm in Pakistan. You know, so it's fake it. Enough.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I would guess in that way you could use Open Collective too, right? If you were looking to just raise funds and you don't necessarily have a legally incorporated body, you could be a DisCO, even just with a basic association, like an agreement between your members, without having a formal legal incorporated status in any country. And then if you need to take funds, use Open Collective to collect those funds and distribute them however you see fit within your organization.
Yeah, I think that Open Collective and Giveth are like two good examples to prototype some of this. Yeah.
Are there any more questions from the fields? Robert is asking, what is the name of the organization that Bob is talking about? I think you were talking about Sensorica, is that right, Bob?
I was talking about Sensorica, and it is, I will put the link to their organization in the chat.
Perfect. Okay, we have a question from Olivia. If you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you see me?
We can't see you. Unfortunately, we will get the settings right next time, but we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, hi from Paris. I have a question about the future of these models. I think especially about these commons-oriented co-ops. And if we just agree that our purpose is to have them grow in the world today, I'm just wondering if the best strategy is to just make sure that people know that it's a great place to live and to work for. So the main purpose would be to have people just join this model to have a great life, I would say. Or if I make it simple, I would say the other strategy would be to make a difference on the market. Of course, we would say it's, of course, both of them. But I wonder, for instance, for DisCO and for the Guerrilla Translation, do you believe that the clients, or whatever you call them, are seeing a difference in the work that you're producing in terms of translation? So that's a question to see what would be the best strategy to have these models grow in the world.
I mean, if you ask me, I think that happiness is a great strategy. Also, like financial success, it's important, but if you're coming from a place of this is a safe space for you to express yourself and do your activism and be supported, that is a very, I feel, attractive and an exciting thing. And, you know, a place where what you do with your productive capacities actually has meaning. with our clients, I mean, it's most of our clients come from the commons, P2P, or decentralized space because they trust us, and they trust us because they like our work and they like what we do, so they sympathize with us. So we've never had like an advertising budget. The pro bono work, the creation of commons has been our advertising budget, and that's how those relationships get created.
Does that answer your question, Olivia?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Cool. We have another question from Sean. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Hi. Can you hear me okay? Great. First, thanks again for the, as other people said, the webinar. It's been great, super informative and helpful and inspiring. So my questions, I have two questions actually, and they're related. And it's a kind of about, I guess, this kind of sounds obvious in a way, but my question is about like radicalizing so my coworkers who are, I've just joined like recently a worker-owned cooperative structured internally that way. And there's a lot of like great people, like they're in there for the right reasons, but also they're sort of technocrats by nature because of the nature of the work, which is awesome. But their primary concern is not necessarily the cooperative engagement or, and let alone the next step where we go from like the technocratic work we're doing or the technological work we're doing to like interacting with a federation of co-ops and sort of entering into solidarity economy stuff. And I wonder if there's any general tips or principles for propagandizing, and also without, I don't want to become like harping on things or be irritating, and I can just like dump endless links, but it seems like there has to be a sort of staged engagement of introducing concepts. So yeah, I guess just like general tips on that. Resources too would also be useful.
Make it fun. So one of the things that I wanted to do with the manifesto again was to have this non-white paper. But we're still in the process of creating things. We want to create DisCO, the comic book, because why not? With your technocrats, they're human beings with needs. So if you go in listening and attending to their needs, you can offer some of these things. This is the Saul Alinsky book, the famous book, Rules for Radicals, where he basically says, what do you do for community work? You knock on every door and you listen to people and you talk to them. And there's no fake in this, like you have to care. And especially we have this, it's good to talk about feminist economics and care work, but let's practice it. Let's find out, let's practice care work. Let's make that effort, because it's a very rewarding effort, and see what emerges. I do think different people are attracted by different materials, and they can be auditory. I was going to say olfactory, but we have no olfactory materials. They can be visual, they can be sound. I love the idea of the comic. Other people may not dig it. And yes, eventually we will have to do a white paper. So I think that we need like a variety of things that, like makes people be inspired, and also let them know that they can be part of the conversation. And that this is hugely tweakable. These are 7 principles, and we're continually like creating more tools and resources. But the more that people take it up, and this is the spirit of the commons, the more effervescent it will be. But it would be cool, Sean, if you tell us how it goes, if you decide to have this conversation and how it's taken.
Yeah, surely will. Thanks.
Did you have a second part to your question, Sean?
Yes, so this is more just like resources, but one thing that I've encountered already, so like I said, like their explicit intent of what we're doing is to try and decentralize and create like locally rooted stuff, but a lot of the terminology and the way of thinking is just inherited from sort of existing tech practices. And with the discussion about needing to find the right vocabulary and sort of train ourselves to wean ourselves from these sort of ways of speaking that poison the way we think, I wonder if there's like, if you know of any particular resource, it's almost like a card of like warning terms, like weasel words almost, to be on the lookout for how they sort of predispose us to falling into certain patterns.
The latest book from David Bollier, Free, Fair and Alive, essentially has that kind of list. It's a little bit long. It's not just like one card, but you could definitely summarize it down. And he goes over, a lot of very standard terms in there, which he basically says are damaging, if we use them, and how we need to wean ourselves off them, and, proposes alternatives. Interestingly, one of them is open, which he pointed out to me quite humorously, since our organization is the Open Co-op. And what he was really saying with that was that, we can't just be completely open, or the commons gets drained, basically. He was referring there specifically to what Stacco mentioned earlier about having semi-permeable or permeable membranes, which basically draw value into a collective pool where people can benefit from it, but where it can't leach out, be taken away. So that book, yeah, is highly recommended. Like, I absolutely loved it. Like, the beginning really opened my eyes to the power of the commons as a concept and a movement and a philosophy for helping sort of unite the world that we're trying to build. Stacco, you want to carry on?
Happily Free from Alive, which is co-authored by Silke Helfrich, and David is the co-author. The book design, all the illustrations was done by Guerrilla Graphic Collective. The Spanish translation has just been finished by Guerrilla Media Collective. We did the webpage. I've just put the link, because now the whole book is serialized online, to that particular chapter that has like all the bullshit neoliberal words and like the new terms and also false dichotomies. So you can check that out, or you can read the whole book if you want to.
Fantastic.
The
Thank
commons
you
is
so
the
much.
glue, yeah. The commons is the glue. Let's sniff the commons glue.
Cool. I think we've got a question from Sam.
And Ruth Catlow, who's one of my colleagues doing DisCO stuff, also has a question for Sean.
So to kind of go back to the question of not really using the word open, I have a lot of questions around like sort of licensing of software that gets written for platform co-ops. Trevor Schultz, you might be familiar with, he advocates using CC+. Is that pretty much what all you recommend for platform co-ops, or is there any other sort of licensing agreement that you'd recommend?
I'm a big fan of the peer production license, which was developed by the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which basically, as far as I understand it, and I'm not proclaiming to be an expert on this at all, basically allows you to stipulate the types of organizations which are allowed to use your code for free. So for example, if you were a co-op, you develop code and under Principle 6, you want to encourage other cooperators to thrive, then you let them use that code for free. But if Google comes along and says, we want to use the same piece of code, you basically get to set your fees. So you can set the barriers as you want. And I think that's the perfect example of a kind of semi-permeable membrane, if you like. To me, it works very well in that respect. Stacco?
And the PPP, so it was developed by Dimitri Klein and Telecommunist, and not by the P2P Foundation. There was a project for commons-based reciprocity licenses, but kind of like comes and goes in spurts. The PPL exists. Literally what it says, it's a Creative Commons non-commercial license with 3 additional clauses. And they say that you can capitalize the work. So it's a non-commercial license, yeah? But it sits somewhere between like copyleft, Creative Commons non-commercial. You can capitalize the work if you're a worker on co-op and if you don't exploit wage labor. So it's an anti-capitalist provision, but it's very simple, but it's legal. It's a legal text that can be used, and it's the one that we use. Dimitri Kleiner distinguishes it from a software license, and he advocates for like total copyleft in software. This is a whole like economics discussion about like production goods and cultural goods. There have been initiatives for software specifically to do what I would call these discriminatory licenses that doesn't let capitalists exploit the commons, but lets commoners do the commons. And I think it's not only like a co-op. If you're a non-profit, but you're not exploiting wage labor, meaning like the boss does not get paid a lot more than the person using the toilets, you can commercially exploit the peer production license.
Does that help, Sam? He's still muted.
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Cool, no problem. I think Stacco said Ruth had a question or a comment.
Hello, Ruth.
Hey, nice to see you. Yeah, my question was to Sean, actually, which was, I'm just so it's interesting always when technocrats aren't concerned with cooperative engagement. And I'd just be interested to hear from him, like what's most attractive to the technocrats about being in a workers' co-op? because I just think if you get to the heart of why people, what's attractive to people beyond the kind of coolness of things, like if you understand, I think it's a question of getting to the heart of what is important to people in their daily lives. And I'm just interested to hear from Sean what is important to people, if not the cooperative engagement. Which are the bits that he's not, which they're not concerned with?
I think, okay, I think you can hear me. So I think the first part, so the main draw, it's partially because part of the people who have organized the group that are interested in cooperative ownership and governance for the sake of like the well-being of the people who are involved in the co-op internally. They are also interested in interacting and like sort of engaging with a sort of solidarity economy. But the people they have been employed in the co-op, a lot of them are from backgrounds, they're pulled in because the research they're doing is relevant to the work we're doing. And like their hearts are in the right place, so to speak. You know, they at least have like progressive mindsets, but they're researchers, and first and foremost, they're interested in doing research, and then they want to like have an okay lifestyle on top of it, and you know, not be doing evil things. But they're just not here first and foremost for political reasons, if that makes sense. They're here to like do the research, and they can get funded to do the research in this connection. I think they're happy to be part of a co-op, but as far as I know, I may be like the only employee who's actually read our like incorporation documents and the sort of governance laws, for instance. Ideally, everybody be reading that because we all have that power, but I just don't think there's that mindset quite. I hope that addresses what you asked.
So your workers' co-op isn't set up, the research topic isn't specifically around cooperative working?
Correct, yes. So yeah,
right,
that's right.
Okay. So it's possible for people to be part of the, so does it just feel for them, does it just feel like an ordinary company? Is it not that important to them that it's a cooperative?
I think that's right. And there's also, you know, it was small enough, a lot of the people, either they're coming from academia or they're from tech startups. And it's small enough tech startups, you can get the illusion of democratic governance and like equal participation, right? Because people have equity, and like there's like informal systems that let people share ideas and they'll sort of take input. And so I think a lot of people are used to that sort of way of operating and don't recognize, maybe aren't so keenly aware of the fact that you completely lose that once you pass a certain scale, or, you know, once the founders decide they don't want to listen anymore. And so they're maybe not as keenly aware of how much there is to lose and how important it is that we leverage what we have effectively.
So your problem might be that you're just operating already too well at the scale that you are for people to be meeting a problem.
I think that's in a way, and it's also, yeah, and it's just ideally everybody would be engaged passionately with the like issues of you know, justice and like post-capitalism and like feminism, but a lot of people, it's just not what they do. They it's not where their passion lies yet. So it's sort of just accidental in that regard.
So can I now be naughty and ask a follow-up question to Stacco?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I wondered if we could spin that out a bit into the DisCOs thing. Like, you've asked some very specific questions to Sean there, and I wondered what exactly you're getting at. Are you trying to wonder how we can grow the cooperative mindset, or where is it coming from?
Well, my question is, like, Stacco, is your idea with DisCOs that that everything needs to be a DisCO? Like, does it bother you to hear Sean talking about a functioning co-op when no one is concerned with intersectional feminist ideas or questions of care, or yeah, what's your how do you position yourself? How do we position DisCOs in relation to others work as cooperatives that aren't doing this kind of work?
I mean, how I position myself, because again, like DisCOs are in development. Sean, I totally understand you, but like the world is crumbling. or to use the Gramsci quote, you know, like the old world is dying, the new one struggle to be born. Now is the time of monsters, but it's also the time of like really extraordinary things where horizons are amplified. I think that if you lead with maybe we're talking about like inclusive language and going by people's needs, you will find that actually like feminism is a really cool thing that can benefit a lot of people and makes us more empathic, caring, and happier persons, you know, whatever your gender may be. Do I think of like DisCO, absolute DisCO modality? No, because that would have to be imposed by violence, which has a tendency to replicate itself in its imposition. There's 7 principles. Like if you take 3, go you. You know, you're already doing something better than what you were doing last week. And we support the social solidarity economy. We support platform co-ops. We support open co-ops. We support like, we don't know what's going to stick. And I think that we have to talk about complementarity in movements. I'll tell you, like we have like a really good relationship with the degrowth movement, and we've done presentations together. And people are always bitching like, "Oh, why are you using that word degrowth? It's so nasty. Why don't you use something more friendly?" And in our commons advocacy work, we don't talk about degrowth, but we're describing the same thing. Why? Because for some people, they need to hear the word degrowth to hook them. Other people do not need to hear it, but the message is very similar. So, you know, DisCOs are one answer, and, you know, it worked for us, and it's based on a lot of research and a lot of suffering and happiness and stuff. But we have to see if it works for other people. And if it's not DisCO, but it's this great feminist economic yoga, like our colleague Cassie proposes, then that's what will stick. But, you know, you just have to keep on trying. I also mentioned that Ruth is the writer of the introduction to the DisCO Manifesto, one of the people who's working closely with us, and a pleasure to work with. So it's really nice to see you here.
Thanks, Stacco. Thanks, Ruth. I see Mike Howes following up in the chat there, you know, saying co-op can be just a cool thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the people put the commons top of the list, sadly, which I really agree with. I think that's what Sean is highlighting here. Like, you know, just because you're part of a co-op doesn't necessarily mean that you want to go and read all of the rules and the member documents, which can really sometimes, you know, be complicated and not terribly fascinating things. Dill, who was on the call, I'm not sure if he's still here, you know, has this sort of inverted pyramid model where he talks about policy actually being in the pit, where everything really normal, all the current activities, sort of people within an organization operate at ground level. And the only times that you should actually have to go down into the pit and deal with policy of the co-op are when there is a question, when you've got a problem, when there's something within the organization which requires that you revert to policy. So rather than seeing it as sort of a hierarchy with your policy sitting on top here, I quite like the inverted pyramid metaphor where policy is actually at the bottom of the pit, but the day-to-day activities all happen up here. And I think, yeah, being part of a co-op doesn't necessarily mean that you're commons orientated or commons minded, but hopefully through the process of educating people about co-ops, which is one of the cooperative principles, we can help to grow the movement, help to encourage people to understand the benefits of contributing to the commons and of the concepts Stacco talks about, like feminist economics. That would be the hope anyway. But Stacco, I mean, to get to the end of Mike's question there, you know, are DisCOs something beyond a co-op?
Yeah, there are mutual learning experience. So here's the funny relationship between commons and co-ops. So you can argue that commons is like our default system for social functioning, you know, since us bipeds, you know, learn to use language and collaborate with each other. I mean, what makes us human is the capacity to collaborate. And the commons kind of like gives us the ontology to be able to do that. Co-ops were created in the 1840s as a reaction to the Poor Laws. And they kind of like codified the practice of commoning into mechanisms that could have legal structures to transact in the markets. But we've lost the forest for the trees. Co-ops have lost this sense of commoning. So DisCOs are explicitly commons-oriented feminist co-ops. So of course, I mean, we expect that there will be some resonance or at least curiosity towards those subjects. But rather than like reading this wonderful book, Free From Alive or Ostrom or all the academic papers, how about you practice commoning? because it's very challenging. Like, you don't get educated for this. You find the same way that you don't get educated to be in a co-op. And lots of people, they have great idealism going in, but then they find that like rather difficult. So we see it as a pedagogical way, and this is something that we've had many conversations with Mike in particular about, leading on his work with Robin Murray and Formación, which he can also tell us about. But education through practice. I'll also say that they're also like a strategy for decommodification. Even though we are selling goods and services in the market, there's also the pro bono side, because we do see a tendency towards decommodification. And with what's going on right now, where you find like, hey, we are hungry, hey, we want to be cared, there's no money, what do we do? DisCOs can prepare us for this. So this is our vision, but it will not evolve.
That's brilliant, Stacco. It's almost the perfect place to stop, and we are reaching 5:30, but I just wanted to give anybody else who hasn't spoken or asked a question, if there's anybody else who wants to speak or answer something, then yeah, raise your hand now. We can have maybe one final question, or we could maybe flick over to Stacco just for a short conclusion. Like, if I don't see any other hands go up, then yeah, I'm wondering, obviously people can go to disco.coop to find out more about DisCOs, but maybe you could just spell out for us the kind of roadmap and the vision of what you're hoping will happen next, and how you see the DisCO model evolving and becoming more usable, more useful, and more well known by more people.
I mean, for us, it's through pilots and the DisCO project. So the DisCO Manifesto was the why, and now we're doing the how. And the DisCO project is predicated on three things: accessible pedagogical resources for people to set up DisCOs as easily as possible, the technological platform for the value accounting, which is what we're working on with Liam, Bob, and other partners. And then there's a research side. There's a lot of interest in doing research in DisCO. And then again, just creating commons so people can create more commons with it. And this is what we're committed to. And of course, ironically, because of what's happening right now, it suddenly becomes more relevant. So we're getting a lot of interest, and hope to be articulating these resources and collaborating with many of you in creating this.
Someone's asking, Sam's asking, is there a social media hub for people interested in DisCOs?
Yeah, there's the DisCO social media accounts, but we're doing most of our social media under the Commons Translation kind of brand. So if you just look for Commons Translation, we're doing our Commons advocacy work and our DisCO work and the Guerrilla Media stuff. We should probably do a newsletter, but we already have a newsletter, which is the Commons Translation newsletter. And if you sign up for that, I can drop the link. You will get all the stuff from DisCO. On the DisCO webpage, we just have so many materials that probably over the coming week we'll put up like a bunch of videos and stuff that we've got. So check in over there pretty soon.
Brilliant. Okay, final question, Stacco. So if you could have anything to help make this more of a success, or if you were after one particular thing that you think would help, what would it be? What can people give? How can they contribute the best in order to help the DisCO thrive?
Space for conversation. I mean, this is the great difficulty that we spoke about with modularity, is we need to have a lot of people in these conversations, but there's an urgency, but we also want to take it slow and go through like a dating phase. Right now, we're focused on finding resources to be able to give the resources. I think that quality of communication is paramount. And again, I don't want to make too many jokes about the blockchain, because I'm kind of like making jokes about a caricature of the blockchain. But look at the usability of like most blockchain dApps. Like, it's pretty crap. So if we want people to adopt this, not just culturally and technologically, it has to be like really attractive to people. It has to like make you salivate. Of course, we come from the arts, we come from graphic design, we come from punk. So we have like all these influences which you see in the DisCO Manifesto. So one thing that, I don't know, to inspire people and to frustrate people in that we don't have a precise roadmap. this is part of the fun of it now.
Brilliant. No, it's a great answer. And actually it plays right back into the Open 2020 objective. Like, we're really happy to have been able to host you here and hopefully facilitate some of this conversation, because people in the chat here seem to have been really encouraged. Like, I think it's great. Like, what I've heard has been quite inspiring, and certainly DisCOs are something that I will be talking to more people about. But the kind of wider objective of Open 2020 is to try and encourage more people to join the same conversation, to determine if we can find a kind of common protocol within which we can have these conversations. So some of these distributed groups, for example, Sean's group that he mentioned earlier, could be part of this wider conversation, that there would be an easy way to draw people in to networked commons initiatives. And it sounds to me like that's exactly what you're asking for. So hopefully Open 2020 will be able to deliver on that request to some extent, but we shall see how things evolve in the run up to the 11th and 12th of June, and in the other webinars, which will be at the same time each Thursday, 4 p.m. BST. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks to Stacco and Bob and Lynn and Matthew for helping, and Sean, everybody else, Ruth, who contributed. It's been really good to have you here. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.